Sir Knights, would like to welcome you to our March Grand Commanders chat. This is going to be a fun one. We're going to have one of our pastors that we just sent to the Holy Land. He's going to give us a presentation. Before we get started, I would like for our excellent prelate, Sir Knight Cox, if he would, to lead us in a word of prayer, and then we will introduce Sir Knight McFadden, and who will make the introduction of the pastor this evening, and then we will get on with Pastor Miller's presentation. Excellent prelate, Sir Knight Cox, can you lead us in a word of prayer, please?
Yes, sir. Loving Heavenly Father, we come to you this hour asking for your blessing and help as we are gathered together. We pray the guidance in the matters at hand and ask that you clearly show us how to conduct our work with a spirit of joy and enthusiasm. Give us the desire to find ways to excel in our work, help us to work together and encourage each other to excellence. We ask that we would challenge each other to reach higher and farther, to be the best we can be. We ask this in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Sir Knight Mark McFadden, our eminent Grand Senior Warden, who will make the introduction. Sir Knight McFadden, you have the con, sir.
Thank you, sir, and greetings, Sir Knights. It is no secret that the Holy Land Pilgrimage and the Knights of the Holy Land are two programs that are very near and dear to my heart. With that said, it is indeed my pleasure to introduce to you that Pastor Mitchell Miller, who is one of the two ministers we were blessed to be able to send to the Holy Lands this year, and who just recently returned from this exciting journey. Pastor Miller lives in Edmond, Oklahoma, and was nominated for this trip by the membership of Guthrie Commandery number 1. He has been a full-time minister for 27 years and is currently serving as pastor of Santa Fe Presbyterian Church in Edmond, Oklahoma. But prior to moving to Edmond, he served as pastor of Falling Waters Presbyterian Church in Hedgeville, Maryland from 1995 to 1999, and then at Falston Presbyterian Church in Maryland. Pastor Mitchell expressed in his nomination form that he was anxious to see and walk the land where Jesus and so many other heroes of the Bible walked. He was expecting this journey to significantly impact his preaching and teaching after the chance to personally experience so many things he had up to only then read and studied about. So I, like you, are very excited to hear what he has to tell us about his experience. And with that, Pastor Mitchell, we will give you the floor.
All right. Thank you, sirs. And I do appreciate the opportunity that you've afforded to me to make this trip and on your behalf. And I did my best to represent you well and not get into trouble. But I will say this, as I say, thank you for this great opportunity. As we start this presentation, I'm better at being interactive. So if there's a question that you have that comes up, please feel free to ask me. I will not be insulted. If there's something that's not clear, please feel free to ask. I would much prefer to answer those questions as we go. All right. Again, thank you for this time to be with you. So let me begin with this. This trip for me was really about perspectives and keeping things in perspective and adding new perspective to my ministry and to the work I do as a preacher and a teacher, and simply as a member of the body of Christ. I want you to take a pause and look at this tree. This is a 2,000-year-old olive tree, which continues to bear fruit. So you can imagine for a moment what this tree has seen pass by it over all these last 2,000 plus years. Imagine what stories it could tell us if it could talk. Now, my hope for this experience was, as I said, to gain new perspectives on the Bible stories that I grew up with, the stories that most of which I know by heart, stories that are favorites of mine, and stories that are a little less known to me and to others, but might give me new ideas and new perspectives on the meaning of these things. As I experienced what it meant to be there and walk the same path that Christ walked, and other heroes of the Bible, to take in the sights and the sounds and the smells and even the touches of what it's like to be there. So that being said, let me move on. Just in front of you, this is the scene from the top of our hotel in Tel Aviv. Obviously, you can see the Mediterranean looks so beautiful and blue. It was a wonderful evening that we spent in that first night. The accommodations all through the trip were fantastic. And as you'll see in a moment, the food was also amazing. In fact, this is for Mark. Mark was curious when we spoke before the trip about the difference between meat meals and dairy meals. Essentially, this is a sort of a smattering of what that would have looked like. Obviously, in keeping kosher, they do not mix the milk with the meat, presumably because they do not want to risk an animal being cooked in its own mother's milk. And I won't go into a long explanation of that because I don't know the whole explanation. But this was actually a very typical breakfast. As you can see in the upper left there, plenty of various kinds of egg dishes, which were very tasty. The breads at every meal were fantastic. At breakfast, there was always some forms of raw fish that you could have. Plenty of fruit and lots of cereals, as well as every kind of imaginable yogurt, it seems, to go with it. That was the typical, as I said, the typical breakfast. And for our dinners, it was much the same without any of the dairy products, including butter. No butter at dinner. But the bread was so good, you didn't really need it, surprisingly enough. And then lots of salads and things to go with it, as well as meat instead of eggs. So and no cheeses outside of breakfast. Breakfast always had a wide range of cheeses to choose from, but none at dinner. Now, as we move on, when I talk about perspectives, not only did I want to learn new things about place there, but I was struck by how similar life was there as it is to here. This is a picture I took in Jaffa, known to us as Joppa. They have painted horses there. Here in Oklahoma City, we have painted buffaloes around the city. So I was struck by the similarities of people here and there, and the similarities continued on. This is a typical street in Joppa. Our guide for the week, our tour guide, was a man named Ezra Aini. He was born in Joppa quite a long time ago, and as he walked us around the streets and moved up and down the many, many steps, at 78, he was quite spry, and we all had a difficult time keeping up with him sometimes. But I want you to pay attention to something on the street. I'm going to focus in a little bit on this blue sign. Joppa was full of these blue signs. Indeed, all of Israel was full of these blue signs, and he stopped and took notice of that. Someone took notice, and he explained that blue was a color that they used typically and put them on their houses. You'll also see it painted onto windowsills and doors and everything else, because these blue signs were, by tradition, used to ward off evil from people's homes. And that struck me in a moment because growing up in Pennsylvania, I am a Pennsylvania Dutchman, and I've spent years being abused by folks making fun of my home culture, as we use things like hex signs to ward off evil from our barns and from our houses. And again, the perspective that all around the world, many people are very much the same. But I did not expect to hear the same, basically the same excuse for how they decorated their houses. Another note on this, pay attention to this. I'm sorry, I don't have a clearer picture of this, but this design that you see, this six-pointed star or six-pointed rosette, is also very prevalent. You see it everywhere in Pennsylvania Dutch art. You see it in Germany, where it's carved into the posts of homes. You see it in a few other nations, and if you pay attention closely, you'll see it pop up in the Holy Land as well. Couple of different reasons for that. One is that it is an ancient Christian symbol that many people overlook. It is the combination of chi and rho, which are two of the Greek letters that we reference a lot in our faith. So moving on, our first big stop after Joppa was to Caesarea Maritima. On the left, you see a picture of the remains. They're still working there, and everywhere we went, they're still excavating. And everywhere you go in the Holy Land, you'll find somebody probably excavating something, because as our guide said, with all that has happened there and for how long people have been there, everywhere you stick a shovel in the ground, you're going to find something. On the left is the palace built by Herod the Great. Herod is the person who built the city of Caesarea Maritima. It was built to be and was the largest man-made harbor in antiquity. On the right is the reconstruction of the amphitheater there, which is still in use. They found the bases of it, the bottom and the foundations of it, and many of the steps, and then rebuilt it to the same specifications. And all through the summer, spring, fall, and summer, they have performances there, concerts and plays and what have you. So Herod, as I said, was known as Herod the Great, not because he was a great guy. It was said that it was better to be a dog in Herod's household than to be a member of his family. Herod does have the reputation, earned reputation of such because he did kill his own wife and two of his own sons because of jealousy and fear that they might overthrow him. But what we can say about Herod is that he was a great builder. He really was. He was crazy, as our guide said, but he was a great builder. Now, Caesarea Maritima is just 3 days from Joppa, which is something to keep in mind here in a moment. And it's 3 to 4 days to Jerusalem. This is where the Roman governor, Pilate, as we hear from in the gospel lessons, lived in Caesarea most of the time. And normally about twice a year would make the trip to Jerusalem for the larger festivals and for some of the statecraft that he needed to be involved in. Now, Acts 10 refers to the story of Cornelius's vision. Cornelius was a member of the Roman army. He was a centurion. He was stationed in Caesarea. He had a vision about Paul, who was in Joppa at the time, and sent people to get Paul as his vision dictated, and there Cornelius was converted because of Paul's own vision on the way to Caesarea, and I'll let you read the rest of the story in Acts 10. Now, I want you to note the statues here. On the right is a statue, what's left of what was once you can see an incredibly huge statue. Only the foot is left. On the left is a statue of the Good Shepherd, but you'll notice that the face has been taken off. And this was a common thing. When someone came in and conquered a piece of territory, they wanted to essentially erase anybody that had been there before them from the historical record. That meant destroying statues and defacing statues, so that the thought was that the previous owners or the previous controllers would be lost in the shuffle. And we know that that was the case in many times, but not always. The monument we build may be destroyed, but the spirit cannot. And that's one of the perspectives that I gained from this. You saw a lot of evidence of things being built and other things being destroyed. And the attempt to destroy was to essentially erase the history from the record. But we're sitting here as Christians now 2,000 years later from the greatest attempt to wipe our faith from the face of the earth, and yet it has always persisted. And all of this excavation, all of this archaeology that's happening in the Middle East, particularly in the Holy Lands, continues each year, year by year, to reinforce most of the stories that we grew up with from Scripture. All those things that the naysayers 30 years ago said, oh, were just stories, could not be real. We're finding more and more evidence to support the biblical record, which was great. I wish there had been time for me to be involved in a dig, to spend some time poking through some things. But then again, there's never enough time, and I really have nothing to complain about. As we move on to our next site, which is just 15 miles to the north. Herod, when he built Caesarea, he also built an aqueduct. The aqueduct led to 15 miles north to the hills of Mount Carmel. Mount Carmel is, of course, as you can see the statue on the left, is the place where Elijah faced off against the 400 prophets of Baal. This has always been one of my favorite stories, where, of course, and this is found to us in about Elijah in 1 Kings 18. This is the famous scene where Elijah is battling with the prophets of Baal over who represents the real true God. He beckons them to come up to Mount Carmel with all of Israel to watch. The rules of the game are that each one will build an altar and place on it some wood and an offering, and the God that accepts the offering will be the true God. Elijah very graciously allows the prophets of Baal to go first. They spend all morning and most of the afternoon crying out to their God, while Elijah sits on the sideline kind of making fun of them most of the time, and calling out, hey, maybe your God's asleep, or he's taking a nap, maybe you should call louder, or what have you. Then they finally give up, and he builds his altar of rock. He puts the wood and then the offering, and then he digs a trench around his altar and has it doused with water, so much water that everything is soaked and the trench is filled with water. Then he calls upon God, who sends a fireball down to consume not only the wood and the offering, but also the water in the ditch, and indeed the altar itself. And then he turns to the people of Israel and says, you see who the real God is? And basically instructs the people watching to go after the prophets of Baal, who they kill. And then, of course, Elijah has to flee. Now, from top of Mount Carmel, which is one of the higher points, and high points are important in the Middle East. On all the highest mountains, those were the places where they would build altars and shrines, because across religious lines, those high places were the places where they could be closest to God and were special and holy places. One of those reasons is that atop of Mount Carmel, which is one of the higher points in that area, it looks over the Jezreel Valley, which you see laid out before you. Now, most people's impression of the Middle East and the Holy Lands is that it's very dry. It is fairly dry, but here in the northern part of Israel, you can see that there's a lot of agriculture that's happening. You can see how green and beautiful it is. It looks almost lush. Part of that is the environment, and part of it is the way the Israeli government has spent a lot of effort on agricultural research. The Israelis invented drip irrigation and have invested heavily to the point where 95% of their water that they use in Israel is from desalination plants along the Mediterranean. So they've become fantastic exporters of agricultural products. This is also from Mount Carmel. It looks at slightly further south down the Jezreel Valley. This is the northernmost Israeli air base. And again, to keep in perspective what's going on here, when the nation of Israel was established in 1948, they were immediately attacked by 5 of their neighbors, their Arab neighbors. They have essentially been in a state of war ever since. One of those neighbors is Syria, which again mentioned later when we get to the Galilee, but Syria sits on its border and to this day has yet to withdraw its pledge to wipe Israel from the face of the earth. This air base, being the northernmost air base, is just 8 minutes flying time to Damascus, which is the capital of Syria. So as we go through the event, the slides, and as you pay attention to events happening in Israel and the Middle East, and if you wonder why they're so military, why the military is so important there, this is why. They do truly live in a constant state of war, and their enemies are very, very close by. One of the things that really surprised me, and should not have surprised me, but it did, it just seemed that everything was so very close together. Which, if you're traveling by foot, it didn't seem very close. But I wanted you to keep in mind that the tension is constant. The state of war is constant in the sense that they are always prepared. That being said, we move on to Megiddo. Har Megiddo is a small mountain, also in the north. Megiddo is an ancient city that goes back very early times, long before David and Israel was originally established. This is an example of the cut they made into the hillside, and you can see in the various levels there, what you're really doing is looking back on history. And that was one of the things that interested me. I was a history major in college and have never really finished off the bug. Most of my teaching and preaching will somehow come around to history, as you will hear plenty of this evening. So you can see that the excavations are there. They go back in time to the days of ancient Israel, days long before ancient Israel, and so on and so forth. Megiddo is a place that is constantly under excavation. They have so much to learn there. These are the steps leading up to the ancient fortress of Megiddo. This would have been the way up to the fortress for most of its history. Later on, when Herod would restylize the fortress and fortified it, he would put in some ramps so that the chariots and the horses could get up into the city through the gates. This is, of course, obviously in the Middle East, water is an extremely important resource. Megiddo, being a fortress, needed a good source of water. The best source of water was a spring which lay outside the city walls. And so to ensure that they would have water, the ancient engineers tunneled down. They created this shaft. It's 180 steps down to the bottom of this shaft. You can see how large it is, and this is hewn out of solid rock. That shaft, when you get down to the 180 feet, it's going in, that's 180 steps down. It will be about 75 steps back up on the other side, and in between is a 230-foot tunnel. It took them 7 months to create this tunnel to the spring. It runs through the bedrock. They started at both ends and worked toward the middle, and somehow met up. It is, at this point, so far, unexplainable how they were able to accomplish this feat of working from two ends and still meeting up, because even today with modern technology, they often find that it's much harder than people think, and yet these people did it all by hand, hewn out of solid rock. So one of the things that we were amazed about is just that, the level of technology in times and that should not have had technology, at least in our minds. So it's a great technical feat and just fascinating to walk through that tunnel. There are times in the past during rainier seasons when you cannot walk through this tunnel because the water is too high unless you want to get wet. Now, why is Megiddo important? People may not have heard of it. As I said, its real name is Har Megiddo, Har being the Hebrew word for mountain, and Megiddo being the name of the mountain. Har Megiddo looks out over this Megiddo Valley, and it is one of the main invasion routes and one of the main travel routes if you're traveling in the region. Now, it remains etched in our minds because the two names, Har Megiddo, have been combined into one. And in Revelation, we hear about the great battle that will come at Armageddon. Armageddon is derived from the words Har Megiddo. It has been a place of conflict for over 3,000 years, we suspect, and probably will continue on into the future. Moving on from Megiddo, we come to another famous story. In Luke chapter 4, we find the story that Jesus has returned to his hometown of Nazareth. He preaches there, and the people don't like what they've heard. And so they drive him out of the synagogue and to the brow of the hill where they intend to throw him off the cliff. And this is the cliff on the front side of Nazareth. Nazareth lies on the reverse slope of this, and this is the hill that they would have tried to throw him off of had he not been able to inexplicably, in Scripture at least, pass between them. This is the synagogue in Nazareth. It's now a Christian church. We know, presumably, well, we don't presume, this one we know a lot about, that Jesus would have gone to synagogue here. This is the synagogue, we presume, is where he sat down to teach and got himself in trouble. As you see, one of our group is reading from Scripture. One of the great things about this trip was just that. Nearly every place we stopped, we took a break and read from Scripture what was happening in that place as it's laid out in Scripture. And so in terms of gaining perspective, to be in that place and listen to the story once again, or to read the story for ourselves once again, just put everything into a new perspective. It wasn't just some faraway place that we could only imagine. We could actually sit there in the actual place, see it for ourselves, and get a much better understanding of what was going on. How large was the room? How was the room set up? Where he would have stood? There would not have been an altar there at the time of Jesus. However, that same area would have been the place probably where the table was that he sat to read the scrolls that were brought to him, and he read Isaiah 61. Which we would find there. So it brings to life, being in that place brings to life these stories in a new way. It puts flesh on the bones of the stories that we've always known and had always heard. This is, continue on in Nazareth, this is the Church of the Annunciation. And again, I would direct you to the lower corner, just above the doorway going into the Church of the Annunciation, and you see that Chi Rho symbol from which the six-pointed rosette is derived from. The Chi being the X and the Rho being what looks like a P, and it stands for Christ. This is on the right is the inside of the Church of the Annunciation. In this little link in the left is where Mary's house was, we presume, from the research done in around 325. This is why they picked this location. The locals, who would still have believed in Jesus at the time, having been there for now a few generations, had venerated the spot. And when Helena, who was the mother of the Emperor Constantine, made her pilgrimage, she went seeking these sites. And this is one of the churches that was originally built by her. It was destroyed and then rebuilt, obviously with modern technology over time, more than once. But Helena had found the place by seeking local citizens and going on the traditions. Now, one of the things that you can ask is, how do we know that these are the original places? Well, the truth be told, we don't know that this exactly is the spot. We don't know that this exactly was the home of Mary. But the best evidence we have fits. It seems to be it's obviously in the right town. It seems to be in the right place within that town from what we know of the culture of this town. Now, is it here, or is it 10 feet away, or is it 50 feet away? One can never really know. But the truth is, it's close enough. We know that it's there. We know the event happened. And as I said, this is the place where Mary received the news that she was going to be with child soon. And as you can see, you probably don't notice in the previous pictures, you step down to where this construction is. And some of this is reconstructed and some of this is original construction. Everything is stepped down because over the course of time, the area filled up wherever we were. And so they needed to dig down to get to the original level. If you think back to the picture of Megiddo and how you dig down into history, it's the same thing everywhere else in Israel. You dig down into history. All right, moving on to John's chapter 2 is what is recorded as Jesus' first miracle. He goes to the town of Cana where this is, and in the story, They run out of wine, and his mother Mary calls on him and says, hey, you need to help him out. Jesus is reluctant, but Mary, being the good Jewish mom that she is, basically ignores Jesus, who says it's not his time, and turns to the steward and says, do whatever he tells you. The story is that they had large stone jars that they used to store water for their cleaning, ritual cleaning. This is an example of one of those large stone jars. So imagine Jesus having 4 of those, and probably a little larger. This one's been beat up a little bit, and turning all of that water in those jars to wine, the best wine you'd ever tasted. So this is an example of one of those water jars that we're looking at. So again, the change in perspective of what those jars looked like. These were not small couple of gallon jars. These were large jars hewn out of rock, which they used for storing water. Now, this is a tomb that we saw literally along the highway as we made our way to the next location. We saw tombs like this in a lot of different places. This is the only one we saw that had a nice round stone door carved out that could be rolled in place. But again, the reality of burial in that part of the world and in their tradition was that when someone passed away, there was no coffin. There's not a lot of wood. So they would put them in a shroud. If you were a Jewish man, you were buried in your prayer shawl, a woman in a shroud. They would place you in a stone tomb like this that was hewn from rock. Every family, for the most part, had their own. And then you roll the rock in to keep the critters out, I suppose, and also to keep the smell in. And you let the body essentially disintegrate. When it was down to just bones, you collected the bones and you would put them in a small box called an ossuary, which you would then bury in the ground. And I have a picture of an ossuary coming up toward the end of just to show you what it was like. But as I said, we saw tombs like this all over the place. So it was a very common thing. This is just one of the sort of better preserved ones, obviously with the rock. And it was just along the highway. We didn't stop. We just took it on the run. So it just sort of opened our eyes to, again, the realities of what life was like there. Now, we get to Galilee. Again, for us, it was about a 35-40-minute drive from Megiddo. And from Nazareth, would have taken Jesus a couple of days. But again, everything very close together. You see that picture of the evangelical triangle. The majority of Jesus' ministry happened within this 25-mile radius. You see the towns of Bethsaida, Chorazin, Tagaba, Capernaum, and the Mount of the Beatitudes. All these were on this northern edge of the Sea of Galilee, all very close together. So when you're reading the gospel, you hear that he traveled from here and he traveled to there and traveled to wherever. And you get this impression that he's always on the go. And I'm sure he was, but the distances were not as great as we can imagine. This is one of the things I think for Americans particularly, we are so accustomed to our world being so spread out. But there it's not. It's all very close together. Israel itself is about east to west is about 100 miles wide, and north to south from the Red Sea, or the tip of the Gulf of Aqaba anyway, to the northern part where it meets Lebanon is about 400 miles. And within that, they have more than 10 million people packed. And that's not including the population of the West Bank and Gaza Strip. So you can understand why, when you look at pictures later on, why it looks so crowded, because it is. Okay, moving on in our picture. Again, this is Tagaba. This is the place of the feeding of the 5,000. On the left-hand side, you see that rosette design, again, that you seem to see everywhere based on that Chi-Rho signature. So again, the rosette continues on. Moving ahead, what did Jesus feed the 5,000? Obviously, this is a mosaic of the loaves and fishes. These mosaics are everywhere. Anybody who had any kind of money, and even some who didn't, would create these mosaics and lay them in the floor. They would be covered over, and then centuries later, archaeologists and others could come by and uncover them. And it just truly seems everywhere you go, there is a mosaic of some kind, or parts of mosaic that if it had not been destroyed. Now, on the left is an olive press. Again, a little something that we learned about the culture that we might not understand. Obviously, that stone's been tipped over a little. It should be laying flat. They would fill that larger basin with olives, not with water. It had just rained there, so filled up with water. And then you roll that stone around to squeeze all the oil out of the olive and out of the seeds and everything. You just crushed everything to extract as much of the liquid as possible. And then they would take all that squeezed olive leftovers and use it as fertilizer and what have you. So nothing ever went to waste. On the right-hand side, you see a different kind of press. This is a wine press. And the difference between the olive press and the wine press is that you don't use a stone to press the wine. All the wine was made and still is made by using your feet to press the wine. And the reason for that is very practical. Grape seeds are very, very bitter. And if you crack those seeds, it ruins the wine. The only way to squeeze the grapes without risking breaking the seeds is to do it with your feet. Your feet are just soft enough that they will not break or crack the grape seeds, and therefore you don't ruin your wine. Both of these were at Tagaba as examples for us to see. Again, fascinating to see that they've taken these large pieces of rock and hewn them into these vessels that they need to use. Now, one of the first things that popped up into my head as we were walking along, this is an olive tree. I showed you the 2,000-year-old olive tree. This one is certainly much younger. You'll notice that there is a shoot coming up from the one side, but you'll also notice that some of that is just a stump. And yet from out of the stump, from where the roots meet the ground, you see new shoots coming up out of the roots and from around the stump of the tree. And this is what we hear referred to in Isaiah 11, which says, a shoot from the stump of Jesse and a branch from his roots shall bear fruit. This is how olive trees live for 2,000 years and longer. Even as the old growth is cut off or is broken off or dies off, new shoots shoot out from the roots around the stump, and it continues to grow out like this, adding new growth on all the way around the outside. They grow up, they get thicker, they entwine themselves, and eventually, as they continue to grow out perpetually, forever, potentially, the center of the tree becomes hollow, and yet it continues to be able to do this. Now I get it. I have read Isaiah 11, I think, or heard it read every day, every year of my life in December as we approach Advent, and never fully grasped what it was or what it meant until I saw this tree. And so, of course, I had to take a picture of it. And then I asked the guide, saying, okay, so is this what they were referring to? And he said, yes, that's exactly what they're referring to. And it's important that it's an olive tree, which I will come back around to later, and why that becomes important to me. Okay, and again, with the olive tree, the thought is generation after generation after generation continues on. And so Jesse being the grandfather of David, it continues on for generation after generation after generation, leading up to the time of Jesus himself. Moving along, this is a beautiful chapel that's on top of a hill overlooking the Galilee. This is the place traditionally where the Sermon on the Mount happened, and here is where Jesus laid out the Beatitudes, which we have come to know so well from Matthew 5. Again, we're able to stand up there and read from Matthew 5 in a small picnic area just below the church that stands there on the right. Now, they built this complex, this church and all, on the very top of the mountain. But the reality is that this is probably where the Sermon on the Mount was delivered. The reason being is the scripture speaks of the fact that he went up on a hill and to a flat place. And this is the only sort of flat expanse on that hill, on that mountain. And as you can see barely see it. It was not a very clear day. It was very hazy while we were there, unfortunately. You see the Sea of Galilee there stretched out before you. But this flat plain, but not quite flat, it has a nice flat slope, is probably where he delivered that. And the reason being, it creates a natural amphitheater effect. If Jesus would be standing on the left, on the lower end, all of the people could be up above him and hear every word he said. Most of that preaching, because of the amphitheater style, the sound carries better this way, and this is why they presume that this is probably the actual location. This was a natural flat spot on that mountain. Again, this formation of a natural amphitheater, and now I see it. I've always tried to imagine what was it like for Jesus to preach to 5,000 people, when he was feeding them, what it was like to Jesus to preach and have all these people hear what he's having to say. Well, it wouldn't make sense if he was standing on the top of a mountain and preaching down to the people. They probably couldn't hear it very well. But here in this natural amphitheater, it begins to make sense. And that's one of those perspectives that I can see it, and now I can share with my people with this picture and also with the description of what it must have been like. From there, we move on to Capernaum. This is the town of Jesus. It's also on the Galilee. This was his headquarters while he was living there. Capernaum also is where he performed a miracle. If you remember, after he meets Peter, we find out that Peter's mother is ill, and Jesus goes to Peter's house to heal her so that she can get up and serve him lunch, essentially. In the center there is Peter's house, or it is presumed that this was Peter's house. Again, you have to remember that Helena and others came some 200 to 300 years after, but the local residents would have remembered where Peter lived, because at this point they would have all been mostly been believers, believing in Jesus. They would have shared those stories and passed them down. So we can presume that there's a good chance this really was Peter's house. The other reason that we can now presume that is in the foreground, you see a wall that's been built and rebuilt. And there's an octagonal-shaped wall around what was the house. That octagonal-shaped wall was originally a Byzantine church built in the centuries in the 300s, maybe into the 400s, around Peter's house. The object that you see above it is a beam that holds up the church that has been built now over the whole site. In the center of that church, we were not able to get in, but have been told about it. In the center of the church is a glass floor which directly overlooks Peter's house. It's just a beautiful location. By building the new church over top, it not only allows us to remember the site and worship at the site, but also preserves the site from much of the weather. Being in Capernaum at lunchtime, we of course were given the opportunity to eat St. Peter's fish. This was a member of our group who couldn't resist himself, and so at my behest, I convinced him to kiss his fish before he ate it, and I got to take a picture of it. But this is St. Peter's fish. You'll often hear referred to in the biblical record. Peter goes fishing quite often, and he's trying to pull in nets. This is probably the fish that he was struggling with to have so many, and it is a form of tilapia. From there, we got to take a little cruise on the Sea of Galilee. It is beautiful. It was gorgeous days that we were there. We had sunshine. The one on the left is a picture I took later in the evening. It was, again, knowing that Jesus and his disciples boated on the Galilee, it was amazing to us. Now, the Galilee, we call it a sea, but it's really just a large lake. You can see both sides very easily. But as we were on this cruise, so to speak, came and moved down the way a little bit, we got ourselves in front of a gap in the hills that surround the Galilee, and suddenly the weather changed. Well, it didn't really change, but suddenly felt that burst of air of wind coming down that valley. And the wind coming down these narrow valleys feeding into it is precisely how storms whip up on the Sea of Galilee, which again helps us to understand, having experienced that sudden wind coming across the water when we hit the right spot. We begin to understand why in the biblical stories there were storms on the Galilee that made it difficult to navigate and, of course, made them afraid. And just further down the Galilee, this is at night, taken from a little jetty that out into the lake from our hotel. This is the town of Tiberias on the Galilee. This is the town where the Jewish leaders put together and finalized the Talmud, which was signed here, but it's called the Jerusalem Talmud because they took it back to Jerusalem, but it was here in Tiberias, which was a center of learning at the time. But you can see how gorgeous it is. And again, at first I had to struggle with the idea because the whole time we were there, the sea was just like this. It was placid, almost glass-like. So it was hard to believe the storms could come up. But again, experiencing that just a little bit of wind one day helped us to understand. Moving on from there, we went to the mountain of the Transfiguration. In Matthew 17, it talks about the fact that Jesus went up to Mount Tabor and leaving some of his disciples at the bottom, he took 3 of them with him. And you see in that picture on the left, in the church that's been built there, you see Jesus in the middle with Moses and Elijah on either side of him who came to meet him. And then the 3 disciples, James and Peter and John, who were there to witness these things. On top of Mount Tabor, which is the mountain of Transfiguration. Again, you hear the story in Matthew chapter 17, if you want to look it up. In the story, Peter proclaims, we should build 3 booths here, one for you, Jesus, and one for Elijah, and one for Moses, and then we can all come here and worship. The reality was Mount Tabor was already a place of worship. Again, I mentioned the fact that high places were important in the ancient of days. Mount Tabor is one of the highest peaks around the area, which you'll see in a moment. Even though Jesus didn't want them to build 3 booths, now there are in the church. They have 3 booths in the church, one for Elijah, one for Jesus, and one for Moses. But there's more to that story as well that does not come through, but became clearer to us as we discussed it. Jesus in the Transfiguration and in the meeting with Moses and Elijah, and I wish I'd have known this a few weeks ago before the trip when I preached the Transfiguration, Moses represents leadership to the Jewish people, and Elijah represents prophecy. And prophecy, we have to understand, is telling the truth of God. Okay, so in their meeting with Jesus at the Transfiguration was to affirm to his disciples that Jesus was the new leader who would bring the truth of God, prophecy, with him, and joins those 2 together. As I said, Mount Tabor is one of the tallest peaks around. High places were always where they found altars. But this is also in Judges chapter 4. This is the same place that Deborah gathered troops 1,000 years before the time of the Transfiguration to defeat Israel's enemies. And it is a steep, steep, tall mountain. We took our bus to the base of the mountain, but because the narrow road and all the switchbacks, the bus can't go up the mountain, and so we had to transfer into a series of taxis. Really, they were vans, small vans, 12-passenger vans that took us up to the top of the mountain. But you can see how high it is and how it commands the landscape around. So it makes sense that Deborah would go there to worship, and from up there they could see the enemy coming and prepare their battle, which would end with the defeat of their enemies and the death of their enemies. All right, moving on from there, we get to a town called Beit Shean. Beit Shean was one of the cities of the Decapolis. The Decapolis were large trading centers. They were Hellenistic towns populated by mainly Romans and Greeks. This city, Beit Shean, is the only one that is on the Jewish Israel side of the Galilee and the Jordan River. People have been settled in this place since the late Neolithic age. put that in, since the Stone Age, people have been living here. However, in 749 CE, the town was completely wiped out by an earthquake that they guesstimate to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 points on the Richter scale. And it was basically abandoned for the next 350 years until till the Crusaders came along and began to look at it. In this picture, you'll see the tree on the right. It's up on the mountain on the far left side of the mountain, but this is a close-up of the tree. If it looks somewhat familiar, it might be. If you've ever seen the movie Jesus Christ Superstar, this is the place where Judas hangs himself. And so that tree is featured in the movie, and it's still standing. It's a dead tree that's been dead now for, what, 40 years since they made that movie? More than that, I think 50 years since they made that movie. Also in Beit Shean, we have one of the best examples of a Roman age theater. This theater was unearthed, virtually intact. The steps you see the people on are the original steps up to that level. You see above it, there was more to this amphitheater, but when the earthquake came, essentially the top 2/3 fell in on the bottom third and covered it up completely until they discovered it, started uncovering it. And again, this is one of those places that they have rehabbed a little bit. It's mostly original, but they have performances there all the time. They've only been excavating Beit Shean for about 30 years. And of course, a lot of it continues, and they are nowhere near halfway done with Beit Shean. Just want to say, on the right-hand side, it's hard to see because I think our pictures take up that space. This is the public latrine. And being a group of pastors, mostly men, we all took time to sit on the latrine and stage pictures of this. I have to admit, it was actually quite comfortable. I think almost every one of the men in the group sat on one of the little stalls and had our picture made. And the women in our group were a little befuddled by that and couldn't understand why we men just had to do that. But it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fellowship around that. All right, this is, again, perspective. The northern part of Israel around Galilee is green. Yes, there's some irrigation that happens, but it is green. It is dedicated to farming. You'll see there on the left, that city up on top of the hill is Nazareth. They generally build all the towns on the hills and the hillsides and the hilltops, and they leave the valleys for agriculture. It is gorgeous, it is lush, it is green. As you move further south, about an hour south along the Jordan, you get to the other end of the Jordan River from the Galilee, and what you find is desert, and it just gets drier the further south you go. On the left is essentially the mouth of the Jordan, and on the right is the beginning of the Dead Sea, and you can see how dry it gets in just an hour's drive. Speaking of landscape, these are the Judean hills. On the left, when you're traveling from the headwaters of the Dead Sea and you move up on the road up to Jerusalem, you ascend, I think, about 2,500 feet in what took us 45 minutes on a windy road. But you can see how rough those hills are. And I mean, they look smooth, but really there's lots of hills. They wind around. The road winds a lot. Now, imagine traveling down that road from Jerusalem to Jericho. You're descending 2,500 feet in a very short time. By the way, the Dead Sea is the lowest place on Earth, on the surface of the Earth. It's 1,400 feet below sea level. Jerusalem, when we get there, will be roughly 800 feet above sea level. So you can see how much the road drops. And with all those hills, the path would have, before there were 4-lane highways, would have wound through there, which makes a lot more sense when you hear Jesus tell the parable of the Good Samaritan. No wonder there were bandits in between. There were lots of places for them to hide. Just on the right, by the way, is a Bedouin encampment. It looks pretty rough living. The Bedouins cannot travel as they used to. They are registered and they have to kind of stay put these days. They still have their flocks, but they don't travel around as they used to. Okay, it's about, like I said, 45 minutes from Jericho to Jerusalem, up through those hills, winding up through those hills, making the Good Samaritan make sense. Now, again, Israel constantly in a state of turmoil, always worried about what's going to happen next. Before we could get to Jerusalem, on the outskirts, of course, we had to go through a checkpoint. In the north in Galilee, we saw very few soldiers, actually. But in the south, or in the middle of the country around Jerusalem, we saw lots of armed soldiers. As I said, they're in a constant state of readiness. During the time we were there, there was an outbreak of violence in the West Bank, up north of us in Nablus. Later on, there would be protests happening in Jerusalem itself. Now, what was going on in Nablus was between Palestinians and the Israeli authorities. That's why there seemed to always be ready. Peace in the Middle East, peace in the land of Jesus is always tenuous. This was our first actual good look at the city of Jerusalem. The big golden dome on the right is the Dome of the Rock, and on the left, that dome is the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And you see the walls in the foreground of those two buildings. That is the Temple Mount. Again, Jerusalem in Hebrew means city of peace, and which I think the irony was not lost on any of us, considering the checkpoint that we went through and the constant presence of police and soldiers who were very, very well armed. Now, Jerusalem really, truly is, it's an amazing looking city. It's beautiful. Maybe not as beautiful as they think it is, but it is a gorgeous sight to behold. I think in part because we know of all the events that had taken place there. In that region, it's not just the Israelis. I think everybody who lives in Palestine, Israel sort of believes in this. They have a saying there that says, when God created the world, he brought 10 measures of beauty into the world. 9 of them were given to Jerusalem. And when God created the world, he brought 10 measures of sorrow into the world. 9 were given to Jerusalem, and 1 for the rest of the world. And that you will find will bear itself out in time. One of our first stops there in Jerusalem was the Garden of Gethsemane. When you're there, and we got to spend a little time in contemplation and chance to read for ourselves and just sort of feel the space. This is the Garden of Gethsemane, or part of it anyway. You can see on the left the very old tree. The older gentleman by the table is our guide, Ezra Aney. You'll see more of him and hear more about him in a few minutes. But being there in the garden, you can suddenly begin to feel the story of Jesus in the garden. Despite it being a very, very busy town, very busy city, right next to a very busy highway, it was still pretty quiet in that garden. And it just helped one get into the mood for what we were going to experience the next few days. Just so you know, directly across the highway and across the Kidron Valley, which runs between the two, just a couple of 100 yards away is what's known as the Golden Gate. This is the gate that Jesus would enter on Palm Sunday. Most of the pictures you see and most of the movies that have been made shows this wonderful long flat plain as Jesus heads into the city of Jerusalem. That's not what it was like. Again, understanding the perspective of what really happened. Jesus made his way down the Mount of Olives, which we'll see more of, which was very steep, and to the Kidron Valley, and then he had to make his way back up the hill in order to reach the Golden Gate and to enter the city. The Golden Gate there is also where the Jews contend that the Messiah will come when the Messiah returns. As you can see, it's been sealed off. It's been sealed off for nearly 1,000 years. So it was sealed off by the Turks. We presume as a defensive strategy. But in the foreground, in front of it, you see that there's a cemetery. That cemetery is a Muslim cemetery. The story we were told was that one of the theories is that the Muslims built that cemetery outside the Golden Gate to prevent the Messiah from returning, because the Jewish Messiah would never dirty himself by walking through a Muslim cemetery. So this is sort of the gamesmanship that goes on in that whole place. But again, knowing about it, reading about it is so much different than actually seeing it for oneself. The next day, we made our way to the chapel at the presumed place of the upper room, which is depicted there on the left. Jesus and having his last meal with his disciples. This is on Mount Zion, which is one of the mounts upon which Jerusalem is built. Below the picture of Jesus and his disciples on the left is a picture of Abraham. This is where Abraham came to sacrifice his son Isaac. So it's an event and a place that is held up by all three religions for that very purpose. And there on the right, we see the trial of Jesus, which happened very close by at the home of Caiaphas, who was the high priest at the time. We traveled around the corner, and you'll see it to the right is the courtyard of Caiaphas' house, where Jesus was tried by the members of the Sanhedrin. These steps that you see descending down, which we were not allowed to walk down, obviously they're fenced off. These are the original steps that were there in the time of Herod. These are the steps that we can pretty accurately perceive were the very steps that Jesus descended when he left the upper room to make his way to the Garden of Gethsemane. And these are the very steps that Jesus would have been dragged back up after his arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane, when he came here to Caiaphas' house, where next to the steps, where he would be put on trial and then thrown into prison. And it is a steep, steep hill, as you can see with the hill across the way. This is one of the prison cells, presumably where Jesus was held. It is an ancient cell hewn out of rock. It's been modified slightly. There are steps down into it now that would not have been there at the time of Jesus. The two holes to the right would be there. It's about an 8-foot drop from that hole down into the bottom. And that cell would have been, the only way in and out would be those two holes that were at the top, again, 8 feet up. So when you were thrown in prison, you were literally thrown into prison. They took you to the edge, gave you a shove, and you fell down in on the hard stone. And that's where you stayed. And if you broke something, so what? If you were able to get out when it was because they threw a rope down and you could climb out. Again, being there in that cell and then remembering the torment and the passion of Jesus, it starts again putting things into perspective. This wasn't just a guy who got slapped around. This is a guy who was treated abysmally, was abused by his captors, and again begins to make more sense of what we have understood. Okay, this is another scene from that same prison area. You'll see the two ropes there to the center left. Those are the ropes that obviously were, they hewn holes into the rock and then put the ropes there so they could tie people up and either hang them by there just to keep them up, or that's where they tied them up so that they could beat them if they wanted to punish. Now, the next day, that same day, we made our way to Bethlehem and took a picture of this road again to remind us that the tension still exists. You can see the sign there reads, "This road leads to Area A under the Palestinian Authority. The entrance for Israeli citizens is forbidden, dangerous to your lives, and is against the Israeli law." Our guide was an Israeli. Our bus driver was an Israeli. They could not enter. So we drove to essentially the border of the West Bank, got out of our bus, got onto another bus with another driver and a different guide who then took us on to Bethlehem. Now remember, Bethlehem is just about 7 miles away. A trip, because of the tensions, because of the checkpoints, that 7-mile trip took us about 45 to 50 minutes to drive. That and traffic backed up. These are the Shepherd's Hills, the Shepherd's Field. It is on the next hill. It's on the hill next to Bethlehem. This is traditionally the place where the shepherds would have been visited by the angels. You can see the star, which is etched in. These were caves originally. They have been filled in to create chapels. Again, and they put chapels everywhere in the Holy Land. Every nook and cranny has been turned into either a chapel or a store. So this is the next hill from Bethlehem, where the shepherds received their message and then decided to go to Bethlehem, and this is where they went. This was our first real scene of Bethlehem. Now you see the churches are prominent, but there's also a couple of mosques there, because Bethlehem, while it was once a primarily Christian town, it is now less than 1% Christian, and it is now Palestinian Muslim. Another view of Bethlehem. And there in Bethlehem, this is the door leading into the Church of the Nativity. You can see the archway of the original door. It was filled in some, and that smaller archway is there. Two stories on that. One is that they would have made it smaller to make it harder to access, particularly as enemies of the church would have wanted to ride their horses in, and this would prevent that from happening. The other reason given is that it is a humility door. Everyone is forced to humble themselves by ducking down and bowing to enter the building. And you can decide on which one is more accurate for the reason for that change in the doorway. I think it's probably a little bit of both. Okay, now this church was built by Helena, the mother of Constantine, in about 330 of the Christian era. And she did it by uncovering, or having people, and I'm sure she didn't do it herself, by uncovering some of the work that Hadrian has done. Hadrian was a previous emperor who tried to hide this location from the faithful. Hadrian was a Roman emperor that did not believe in Jesus, was not a godly man. So as I said, he tried to hide the place of the birth, but through the locals who understood and knew what was going on in Helena's work, they were able to create this. On the right is the very ornate altar within the church. It is an Orthodox altar. You can tell because it is so ornate. On the left is a picture. You have to go, they funnel us down steps again, down below the level of the church into what was the cave, or what then was the stable. And this is what it looked like underneath there. This is presumably, again, and with fairly good accuracy, probably, this is the place where Jesus was born. Now, along the wall, if you look back, you'll see there's a sort of a thick rug that's been there for a long time, and there are little holes in it, like this, which is covered so that they can't rip the things off the wall. But those holes are there, so they're touch holes, so people could reach through and be able to touch the actual stone walls. And touching the stone is an important thing over there. I think it's important for all of us, because pretty much all of us spent as much time touching things as everybody else did. And this is one of those evidences of that. Moving on, Sunday morning while we were there, we had worship together. The picture on the right is most of our group, sponsored by you all from across the country. It's a happy time because we're all getting to sit down for a few minutes, preparing ourselves for worship. This worship took place in what is now known as stop number 7 on the Via Dolorosa. This is the original gate through which Jesus exited the city with the cross and made his way to Calvary. We are sitting in the gate area. The picture on the left shows the archway, which was the original gate. If you could get through that arch, it would lead you to Calvary's Hill, which, again, you can see how far they had to dig down just to get to the top of the arch, because destruction of the city a few times filled everything in, and they're constantly, again, working on it. These were the 2 leaders of our groups, members of your order, as far as I know, Bo on the left and Nathan on the right. And they led us in worship and communion on that Sunday morning. It was a wonderful, moving experience. Again, one of the perspectives that I had, which was a wonderful experience for me, and has fit into one of my criticisms of the church, if you will, is that we come from across so many denominations and we spend so much time fighting amongst ourselves. And I've often ventured forth to my congregation, imagine what we could do as the body of Christ if we all were actually unified under the banner of Christ. During this trip, we were from non-denominational churches, from Pentecostals to Free Baptists to Southern Baptists to Lutherans, Presbyterians, Methodists, Episcopals. And we were all there together, and we had the most wonderful time together, fellowshipping together as brothers and sisters in Christ. We were able to set aside any of those differences that we hold up so strongly here in America to be there together as the body of Christ. And it was part of that moving moment to have us all taking communion together. I'm sure for a few of them it was a little uncomfortable. I know for a few of them the way we did worship there was kind of new to them. In a lot of the locations where we read scripture, we also sang songs together, and there was always somebody who was not familiar with what we were singing because it's outside of their tradition, particularly those who are coming from the evangelical free church traditions. They were not familiar with the old hymns that some of us in the mainline churches are used to. But again, it was wonderful to share that experience and to have eyes opened to music that they weren't familiar with, and how wonderful it was, and to be sharing this time of fellowship among pastors. And that, again, is one of the things I have to thank you all for. Your willingness to bring people together from across denominations to help us start breaking down those barriers is something that you should all be incredibly proud of. And something I have been extolling to my people here in my church, and will continue to do so to anyone who's willing to listen, about how we as the church need to break down those barriers, again, because we need to be much more on the same side when it comes to serving Christ. We got some free time to travel around the city. All of us did a few different things, did some sightseeing around, but the next big event that evening was one of the more moving times that we had. This is Fursan Assam. He is Fursan Assam. He is a Lutheran Palestinian Christian pastor. We are all grown up, told that when you have family dinners, you should not speak of religion and politics, because we know what fights there are. Fursan came to speak to us about what it's like to be a Palestinian Christian in the midst of Israel-Palestine. He is, by his own definition, stateless. He holds a Jordanian passport, but Jordan no longer claims the West Bank. It is under the authority of the Palestinian Authority, which is not officially a state. So he is, as I said, stateless. He's not a citizen truly of anything or anyone. This has made it very difficult. His home is in the West Bank. It takes him over an hour to get to his church in the old city of Jerusalem, and sometimes longer than that. It has made life very difficult. In around 1900, 55% of Israel-Palestine was Christian. It is now roughly 1%. Some of that is because the increased populations of Arab Muslims and of Jewish Israelis. But a large part of it is due to immigration. Many of the Christians have felt the squeeze. I have a personal friend who is a Palestinian Christian. He was born in Jerusalem himself. He's a few years younger than me. And when he was a child, his family moved to the United States because it was so very difficult to live there and to make a living as a Palestinian. When the Israelis siege Fursan, as he said, all they see is an Arab. And Arabs do not have the same rights that everyone else has in Israel. When his Muslim neighbors on the West Bank see him, all they see is an infidel, someone who believes in Jesus, and they want nothing to do with him either. All of this is a shame. In 1967, 20% of the population was Christian. Now, again, 1%. So it's a very difficult place. They are squeezed by both religion and politics, as I have said. And one of the things that messages I want to bring back, and this is at his behest, is to come back and tell more people about what it's like for the Christians living in Jerusalem and the surrounding areas, how very difficult it is, and find ways that we can support them. And what he told us is, first and foremost, he begs us to pray for them, to pray that they can remain, to pray that they can continue to witness, because even witnessing is difficult. He is not allowed to evangelize, not even on the telephone. If someone calls him and wants to talk about getting baptized or joining his church, he can't say anything over the phone because it's being listened to. He's not allowed to do it by the Muslims or by the Israelis. And so what he has to say to them is, meet me at my church so we can talk. And this is something that I think was a bit of a shock for many in our body that was there, because it's a world that we cannot fully understand. And so, again, I very much appreciate the Knights Templar arranging to have him come in and speak to us as brother pastors, to hear what he had to say, to be able to reach out. And more than anything, our ability to witness to him and to minister to him, because just listening and telling stories gave him an opportunity to tell his story, to share that with us. And then we made him sit in a chair in the middle of the room, and we laid hands on him and we prayed for him, which was his primary request of us. And I hope that you will go back to your own churches, to your own communities, and lift up the plight of Christians in Palestine, and pray for them. Pray for them again and again and again, because they are in desperate need. I suppose they will always maintain a few Christians because someone's got to be there for all the shrines. There's 3 million people a year that come through Jerusalem, primarily Christians, visiting all the holy sites. It is a huge part of their income every year, but the Christian churches there don't really get much from it. So we need to continue to pray. And again, I beg you to remember the Christians of Israel and Palestine, and understand how very, very difficult it is for them living there. And if you want to contact me and learn more about that, I'm very happy to talk with you more. All right, so going back to our tour, next day we traveled to the Western Wall. The wall on your right is what's known as the Wailing Wall. It's wailing because the rocks are wailing and weeping, and will do so until the temple is rebuilt and the Messiah returns. This is a place of deep holiness to the people of Israel, to Jews everywhere. This wall on the right is not actually the wall of the temple. It is the wall of the Temple Mount. This was built as a retaining wall. And you can see the difference. The original wall goes up to where the rocks are large, and then they turn to smaller rocks. Those are parts that were rebuilt later on in repairing the damage to the Temple Mount. Roughly where the Dome of the Rock stands was the original temple built by Solomon. It was destroyed by the Babylonians, rebuilt by Zerubbabel and Ezra, as we hear in the Old Testament. And then when Herod came along, the great builder he is, he wanted to improve it. He did not tear down the old temple, but what he did was he created this huge retaining wall to create this large, what we now call the Temple Mount. And then he went and built an even larger temple over top of the original temple. It was large and gaudy and amazing. All the models and pictures that we have seen, and just vastly expanded everything. As I said, you can go to this, anyone can go to this wall. We as Christians were allowed to go and pray at the wall and put our hands on the wall. On the left-hand wall, you'll see an archway and a tunnel. That is there because when they started excavating, they opened that tunnel where that archway is, and they tunneled it back under there to the point where they are pretty sure that that tunnel leads to a spot, excuse me, which is directly under what would have been the Holy of Holies when the temple stood there, and allows them to go in and pray. Now, sadly, there's a wall. It's very barely visible in the foreground. that on one side, the near side is where the women are allowed to pray. On the far side is where the men are allowed to pray. This is another site. You can see that wall, the demarcation. The women went down the right side. The men could go down the left side of this little lane, this little wall fence to go and pray. This is an up close I took. You're allowed to take pictures and go up to the wall to pray. Now you can't quite see it here. If you look very closely, there's little white things and stuff sticking out of the corners of the wall. One of the traditions is to write prayers on a piece of paper and slip them into the cracks and the crevices on the wall. Now the question is, what happens to them? Well, they don't get destroyed. Twice a year, at the time of the Passover and at the time of the Atonement, there is the chief rabbi there at the wall, the synagogue near the wall there, and his assistants. They go around and they collect every single one of those pieces of paper. And because many of them either have God's name or refer to God, they cannot destroy them. So they collect them twice a year, they put them in jars, and then they bury them up on the Mount of Olives so that they will be there when the Messiah returns. Again, I can't even begin to imagine how many they have preserved in this way. Again, closer up picture of the wall. If you enter the tunnel, which we were all able to do and could go to the back and stand and pray under the Holy of Holies just because it's that. But inside there are books, this beautiful, you can see what the walls are like inside. This is a rabbi that grabbed one of our group and pulled him over to the side and showed him this book that's on the left. This was a picture taken by one of our other members of our group. And then he prayed for him and prayed for his family, which was great. And then he asked for a donation for the synagogue. So it was an interesting experience, but it was a wonderful, very moving experience. From there, we got to go up on the top of the Temple Mount. This is the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is on the south side of the Temple Mount. It's the only actual mosque up there. We were allowed to go up there. As I said, the perimeter outside the Temple Mount is patrolled and controlled by the Israeli army, but the Temple Mount itself is manned and protected by Muslim members of the Jerusalem police force. While we were up there on the Temple Mount, we saw about 4 of the members of the police force, all very well armed, escorting 2 Jewish gentlemen, young men who were clearly Hasidic, who wanted to come up to pray. But any Jew that goes up there to pray is usually bracketed by the police and escorted to a faraway corner of the Temple Mount to pray because they don't want anything to get started. Again, the tension was always there and it was always in the air. But we were allowed to be up there, and it was amazing to hear the story of what's going on. This is looking toward the Dome of the Rock. That is 24-karat gold on the dome. And these are the steps leading up to it. Now, a lot of people get this wrong. The Dome of the Rock is not a mosque. It is a shrine. And it is the place where Abraham was raised up into heaven from the rock that is there. Okay. Again, people are very touchy about this. I did ask a question of my guide, knowing a little bit about history. He had revealed to us that he was a soldier in 1967 during the Six-Day War. He later revealed that he was actually one of the paratroopers who liberated the Old City and the Temple Mount. What I could not get him to say is, when that happened, one of the stories that came out of that is there on the top of the Dome of the Rock, as you can see, it points, sticks up. Someone hung an Israeli flag that hung there for about 4 hours. And then they were ordered to take it down because the Israeli leaders did not want pictures taken of it for fear that all of the Muslim world would then rise up against them in 1967. So out of fear of that. But I asked him, because of all that tension, because of all that, I asked Ezra, I said, did anything happen to the man who raised the flag over the Dome of the Rock? And he strongly asserted, That never happened. It was raised over to the left-hand side on top of something else. But friends, I have to tell you, I've seen pictures of the flag flying over the Dome of the Rock. So even now, it's a source of tension that I don't think he's willing to admit. Now, I'm not sure if that means that he was actually the soldier who did it. That soldier's first name was Ezra as well. But regardless of that, I was not going to push him on it and get any more answers. But just as I said, even there, you could sense the tension a little bit. And it's really kind of sad that you feel that tension. That tension was heightened, as these are just more pictures up close of the dome. It's absolutely gorgeous. It's amazing. The architecture and, of course, the beauty of the walls there. This is a gold menorah, which sits in the middle of a square in the middle of the Jewish quarter. This is one of the things that has been prepared for the day when they rebuild and build the third temple. There's an organization, Jewish organization, that has over the last 30 years been preparing all of the elements that will go into the new temple. They've done so. They are now only waiting for the construction of the new temple. Some of them are calling for the building of the temple even now. The feeling being, we control the city, we really control the Temple Mount, let's rebuild. But in order to rebuild, they would have to knock down the Dome of the Rock. And you can imagine what kind of tension that would cause. He took us off there and we came to the Lion's Gate. Pay attention to all of the divots in the rock. Those are bullet holes from the Six-Day War in 1967. This is where he and his comrades entered the old city and had to fight their way in. And you can imagine how intense the battle was. There said, note the bullet holes everywhere around there. But they were not allowed to use their weapons or any heavy weapons on the Temple Mount for fear of, again, causing more tension and of damaging anything. Now, the Jews have a tradition called a mezuzah, and a mezuzah is some kind of a case. Doesn't matter what it's made of, doesn't matter what it looks like, but it contains the Shema, which is a Jewish prayer from Deuteronomy 6:4. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is the Lord alone. It needs to be handwritten on a piece of parchment, not paper, but parchment, and rolled up and placed inside the mezuzah, which then the mezuzah is attached to the doorposts of their homes so they can kiss it, touch it, acknowledge it when they enter and when they exit their homes, according to the commands laid out in Deuteronomy 6. To put it on your doorpost and lintel and wear it on your head and your wrist, which is what you saw with those phylacteries on some of the Orthodox Jews down by the Wailing Wall. This is a mezuzah. After the 67 war, one of the gates that had been originally sealed off was opened by the Israelis, and they took some kind of artillery shell, cut it in half, and made two mezuzahs, which they then attached to, it's not the Lion's Gate, but it's another gate on the other side, as in recognition of what had been done. But as I said, you can make your mezuzah out of anything you want. This was made out of a shell casing from 67 to commemorate not only the liberation, but also that this was a doorway into one of Israel's holiest places. Again, a picture of the Golden Gate through which the Messiah will enter. You see on the left, the Muslim cemetery. On the right, across the valley, on the Mount of Olives, is the Jewish cemetery. These pictures don't really do it justice. Both of them are large. The one on the Jewish cemetery is massive. Again, this is the gate through which the Messiah is to return. Our guide remind us that all three of the religions that are there, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, believe in the resurrection. These graveyards comprise over 1 million graves. And as he said, he does not want to be here on the day of the resurrection, because he says, if you think it's crazy now, imagine over 1 million people who've just been raised from the grave, wandering around trying to figure out where they are and what they're doing. which was a humorous moment for him to break some of the tension after what he had described to us there at the Lion's Gate. And he did not go into detail describing the battle. Clearly, he was still moved by it. He lost a lot of friends in that fight, and but just barely made mention of it. Now, just north of the Golden Gate, you can see the walls of the old city there on the top. This is the Church of St. Stephen. This corner is where all of the stonings had taken place in the old days in Jerusalem. Everyone who got in trouble and were stoned, this is where it happened. And so, of course, years later, the Christians built a church there at the place of Stephen's stoning, which is described to us in the book of Acts. This is at the head of the Kidron Valley, which runs between the old city of Jerusalem and the Mount of Olives. As I said, this church was within 200 to 300 yards from both the Golden Gate and from the Garden of Gethsemane. I bring that up again just to mention how close everything is together. The trip from the upper room to the Garden of Gethsemane is less than a mile. And you're winding your way down the Kidron Valley and then up the hill into Jerusalem to Mount Zion. So again, everything's very close together. Another story from the life of Jesus. This is on the south side of the Temple Mount. You see these steps. This was the original steps, and you can just barely see the archway there on the left. These were the original steps up into the temple. You would go through the temple and up the stairs and out onto the plaza where we're standing in front of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. They're closed off now. But this is the place where Jesus would have driven the moneylenders from the temple. It wasn't actually in the temple. It wasn't even on the Temple Mount. No Jew would have allowed any kind of business to be done anywhere near the temple or up on the Temple Mount. So when it describes, again, that Jesus drove the money changers from the temple, it was actually from here. There was the steps and the plaza in between is where they would have set up shop to sell sacrifices at vastly inflated rates for the pilgrims who were coming in for the Passover or from the atonement, depending on what time of year it was. And again, putting it into perspective and seeing it for ourselves. It erased the image of Jesus actually in the temple, which is how it's often portrayed to understand. And I often struggle with that because I couldn't imagine that the leaders would allow that to happen near the temple like that. And they did not. It was just outside the Temple Mount on these steps. Then we made our way into town to do the Via Dolorosa. I admit I do not have good pictures of all the stations of the cross, but this is where it begins. This is the church in the area of the Antonia, which was the courtyard of the Roman fortress on the edge of the Temple Mount. This is where Jesus was brought to be convicted by Pilate. I will tell you one of the reasons that I didn't get a lot of good pictures is that, number one, they're not far apart. Number two, the streets are very narrow and very crowded. Which again changed the perspective. What we saw going through there and what was described to us was that we were reminded of the fact that for most of the people in Jerusalem, the conviction and death of Jesus was just another day. Nearly every day, someone left the Antonia, the Roman headquarters, and made their way through the streets on the same route, through the same gate, to the Calvary Hill to be crucified. It was an almost daily occurrence. And so when Jesus made his way through the very crowded streets, there were probably a lot of people who did not notice. Even now, making your way through, there are a lot of people who are just going about their business. So that, for me, helped me to understand the conversation that Jesus has on the road to Damascus with the two disciples that don't quite recognize him. If you remember the story, two men are making their way from Jerusalem to Emmaus on the day of the resurrection. And a man that they don't know comes up to them and is speaking to them, and they say, "Are you the only person who doesn't know?" Well, no, he wouldn't have been the only person. There were probably a lot of people who didn't fully know what was going on the weekend that Jesus was crucified and then resurrected. So again, helps me to understand what is happening in the story. Now, this is something that you will see etched in the floors all over Israel. Wherever the Romans were hanging out, you would see these kind of etchings. This is essentially a game board. The Romans, soldiers are soldiers, and oftentimes they're bored. The Roman soldiers were bored a lot, and what their favorite game was called Basileus, or the Game of Kings. It goes back to a very ancient Saturnalian festival in which people would be selected, and they were made up to be kings, and they were mocked as part of the festival, and then at the end of the festival they were executed. In more modern times for them, which is the time of Herod and the time of their occupation of Jerusalem and the what's now the Holy Lands, they would have created these things. The idea being you cast lots, which was actually pieces of knuckle bones, pig's knuckle bones of all things, onto another spot of etching on the floor, and then they would push little figures based on the rolls around, and to see who gets to be the king. Whoever makes it to the king spot first gets to order the other ones around who are playing the game. So it's a gambling game of sorts in which they get to order people around. It describes to us in the Bible of the soldiers casting lots for his clothes. It talks about them putting a robe on him and a crown of thorns. That was all part of this Basilisk game. Whoever won was in charge, and it fit right in with their old festival and what they used to do to each other to the losers of these games. And that's what they did to mock Jesus. They mocked him just as they mocked soldiers all along the way. So what was amazing to us is that Ezra kept pointing out, we saw this in the plaza in Capernaum. We saw it not in Nazareth, but we saw it somewhere else in Galilee. We saw it at more than one place here in Jerusalem. So it was amazing to me how common it was. This is the place in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre where Jesus was nailed to the cross. Again, as I said, every nook and cranny is a chapel. This is a Roman Catholic chapel. It is actually an incredibly gorgeous mosaic, as you can see. But this is one of the stations of the cross, again, where Jesus was nailed to the cross. Just to the left, through that little archway on the left-hand side, is the place of the crucifixion. This is an Orthodox chapel on top of Calvary's Hill. On the right, you see what's enclosed in glass, which is part of the bedrock on top of what was Calvary Hill. And then if you look where Jesus is hanging on the left, there's a table on the left there. And under the table, you'll see that golden circle and a hole in the middle. And remember what I said about touch holes? This is the place where you crawl under that table and you reach your arm down into that hole so that you can touch the bedrock on top of Calvary Hill where Jesus was crucified. Again, is it in that exact place? We don't know, but it's close. Close enough that we can be fairly certain that it was within 5, 10, 15, 20 feet. That is the top of the hill. We also know this because this was again, one of the churches built at the direction of Helena, the Emperor Constantine's mother, who came here in the 300s. So again, just 200 years later. The story is that she was checking out this site. She had been directed there, and there was a funeral going by. And when you're the mother of the emperor, you can do whatever you want. So she literally stopped the funeral, the story says, and interviewed everybody to find out exactly where these things took place and where it was. And of course, there were those who remembered and had the stories passed down to them. Now, this is in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. To get to the top of this hill, you walked up these very ancient old stone steps, which are very, very worn and very uneven because of it. Again, imagine the millions of visitors that have been visiting this site for almost 2,000 years. It would, of course, get a lot of damage. Back down the other set of stairs, you get to the bottom and you see this gorgeous mosaic on the wall. This depicts Jesus having been brought down off the cross, is having his body prepared. I took this picture, and then right behind me, I did not get a picture. There is a slab of stone that people were down touching and rubbing pieces of fabric on to take home with them, handkerchiefs and whatever. That stone is the place, the stone that they believe was used to prepare Jesus' body. I did not take a picture of it because I just didn't want to offend anybody who was there on their own pilgrimage. I didn't think it was appropriate. Moving along, you can see the walls behind. This is an enormous chapel where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and in the foreground you see what is essentially a chapel within a chapel. This is the tomb that is regarded as the tomb of Christ. You walk around the tomb and you see how tall and ornate it is. It is an Orthodox place. And at the very bottom, you can see that, again, it's a very small archway. You step down into the tomb area. There's a small chapel area that's probably, maybe 10 feet square, but not quite square. And then there's another small archway into the actual, what they believe is the actual tomb of Christ. Only about 5 people at a time can go into the actual tomb area where you can touch the tomb, the rock that covers the tomb, and say a little prayer. You don't get a lot of time because there's a nun right outside there. You can't see her because she's inside the little chapel area, and she directs the activity, tells you which 5 get to go in, and then claps her hands and tells you it's time to get out. And she was kind of scary looking, so nobody really wanted to mess with her. I know I didn't. Now, again, what's interesting about this, and again, to keep it in perspective, is the actual site of the tomb right here? We don't know for sure. But this is what has been regarded as the place of the tomb for over 1,000 years. However, from where you're standing, behind this tomb area, a doorway leads into this small chapel with this very, very ancient altar. This was discovered later on, rediscovered, I guess. And in this chapel, off to the side of this chapel, in the antechamber within the church, you find this tomb. The reality is that in that chapel and outside this tomb, they found an inscription bearing the name Joseph of Arimathea. So it could very well be that this is the actual tomb used by Jesus, because we know it belonged to Joseph of Arimathea. This fits in with the tombs that we saw, more so than the other one does. Along the way, so it kind of fits in that. You can see the archway where the rock would have stood. So is this the actual tomb? I don't know. Me personally, I'm a little more inclined to say it was this, but not the other one, and that's okay. I'm not going to put my faith in either one of them. For me, again, it's close. This is 25 feet from the other tomb. So who knows? All of which it was moving, all of which caused me to pause, all of which will allow me to speak to my congregation, either when teaching a class or even preaching, and talk about just how small this tomb is, to talk about how close together they are to Calvary's Hill, to talk about how moving it was simply to be there. Now, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre has a number of chapels off the centerpiece where the tomb is. This is one of them. Obviously, it's an Orthodox chapel. While we were there on Sunday, there were 3 worship services going on in the same building, 3 different groups. This is something, if you see it back, you can't quite see it in this one, but in the foreground from where I'm standing and taking this picture is this little scripture. This is, we're told, is the belly button of the world, someone described it as. In their tradition and in local tradition, this is the very spot of the beginning of the creation of the world. Which I thought was fascinating that they could put the demarcation as the very spot, which again takes me back to the question, is this the spot? I don't know. And frankly, it doesn't matter. I was reminded as we were having the conversation about how close is it? Is it really here? The question, as I remembered from one of my professors in college, is not the real question is not to ask whether or not this is the place, or whether it happened exactly the way we tell the story. The question to ask is, what difference does it make to you? And for me, the difference is the assurance that, yes, here it happened. You cannot walk this area without feeling and sensing the faith of the millions that came before me, without anticipating the faith of the millions that will come after me, without truly feeling the energy of that place, which has been set aside in Christendom as a place of incredible holy intent. So again, what difference, it again brought back those old words that I've clung to since I was in college. The question is, what difference does it make? And it makes a lot of difference to a lot of people, particularly to me. Now, this is the outside of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It's large, it's beautiful, it's gorgeous. And what we have to understand is that this Church of the Holy Sepulchre that we now see and go visit is just 1/3 the size of the original church. The church, again, 3 times larger. How important was it? It is truly a place of holiness, and yet it is a place of conflict. It was the destruction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre that kicked off the Crusades. When the Muslims destroyed the church, the Christian world was incensed, and that is the impetus they used to launch the Crusades, to try to free the Holy Land and to free all the holy sites and to allow them to rebuild this church, which they later did. This is the church that was rebuilt by Crusaders. Again, not to the same scale, because they just didn't have the money that Helena did when she originally built it. The other part about this, again, the irony, and for me, the tragedy, tensions over who's in control of this church has led to even more conflict. Within the chapel, you see Catholic shrines and Catholic chapels, and you see Orthodox shrines and Orthodox chapels. The Eastern Orthodox and the Roman Catholic Church have always hotly contested who should be in charge. That in and of itself led to a moment where some Orthodox priests got into a fight with some Catholic priests, of all people, and others, and that fight kind of blew up in everybody's face, because word got back to Europe, and Napoleon III, who was the Emperor of France in the 1850s, hearing about this, was incensed by the treatment of the Roman Catholic priests and petitioned the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire to be the person who was officially in charge of the protection of the Christians in the Ottoman Empire. He granted that request, which upset the Roman Tsar, the Russian Tsar, who had previously been the one who was supposedly the protector of the Christians in the Holy Land and in the Ottoman Empire. And that was one of the issues that took a religious excuse and applied it to a political issue, and ended up causing the Crimean War, in which hundreds of thousands eventually died. This is, I think, and I don't say this lightly, this is the shame of our broken Christendom since those days, that we have allowed ourselves to split, when instead of unified in Christ, we have split ourselves along these lines, and we use them as an excuse to be in conflict. Now, despite the conflict there is over this history, there is something that I found very fascinating. He was not there present at the time, but our guide told us that often there's a gentleman that sits there by the doors. He is the man who holds the key. In fact, his family has held the key to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre for 700 years. He is not a Christian. He is a Muslim. Because the Christians could not agree on who should be in charge and who should hold the key to the door, they gave it to a Muslim family. And as I said, it's been in his family's possession for 700 years. So it's amazing to me. More I could say. I did want to lift this up to you. If you look at the lintels above the doors, there's very interesting marking there. It's like a Y with a line with some Y's coming off, and they go in both directions over top of either door. In my research, well, not really research, these are regarded as actually Templar Mason marks. Masons working for the Knights Templar back during the time of the Crusades often left these marks on the places where they worked. So I thought that you might appreciate seeing that if you weren't aware of it and hearing it for yourself. Now, can I attest to that? No, this is just what I've heard and been told and read, but I wanted to make sure I took a picture of it with you all in mind when I came back to show you. All right, these are excavations in the Jewish quarter. That's about 30 feet down. We are on street level, which is actually a little lower than the street level above us. And these are excavations down looking for the base of the original walls of Jerusalem. As I said, the excavations go on, and the further down you dig, the closer you get to the beginning and to the original history. This is near what is called the Cardo. This is, again, below street level. You can kind of see that the sun is coming in from the left. That's where the actual street is. This has been excavated out with a little bit of reconstruction. The Cardo, well beneath street level, was the original main street in Jerusalem. This is where the shops were. This is where all the trading went. And this is a mural that was standing behind me when I took the picture, this picture. This is the mural that's behind me, giving a depiction of what it would look like. Now, as you look at this, you see what would have been theoretically a traditional, a normal everyday street scene on the Cardo at the time that Jesus was in Jerusalem. But if you look down to the lower right, you'll see that they painted this mural intentionally to show that it is sort of history reaching out to us or us reaching into history. Here's a close-up of that corner of the mural. As you can see, you have the traditionally dressed girl who's giving a pomegranate to the very modern-looking boy with his backpack. We were told that the painter of the mural did this to show that for them in Jerusalem, as we can very clearly see, history is not something that just happened in the far past. It is very much a part of their present. And whether you're reaching into the past or the past is reaching out to the future, this is what the mural depicts, reaching into the past, where past meets present. But speaking of signs of violence, this is in the Armenian section outside of Armenian church. This was something that was in the Armenian church. You can see the blackness above. It's black because it is scorched by the fire when some of the Muslims decided they were going to burn the city. Some of it may have happened during one of the wars when destruction happened. But again, violence is never far away. This scorched Armenian thing. Another part of it is, have you ever heard the old term, knock on wood? Some contend that this is where it comes from. Again, this is in the same Armenian churchyard. The Armenians and the Christians for a long period of time were not allowed to ring bells in Jerusalem. It was, they said, a Muslim city, but we allow you to have your things here, but you can't ring your bell. So they had this piece of wood hung outside the Armenian church, and they would knock on the wood to summon people or to let people know that they were out there. So in lieu of ringing the bell, they knocked on wood as a sign of good luck in some ways. As I said, this is the menorah in the plaza. The tension's already high. These are people who are preparing, if they had their way, to tear down the Al-Aqsa Mosque and to tear down the Dome of the Rock and to rebuild the Third Temple. God only knows what would happen. Now there are others who have prepared all this for the third temple, believing that when the third temple comes, it will be with the Messiah, and it will he will reestablish that. So there's a lot of discussion about what that's going to look like. Near the end of our journey, I apologize. I know it's been taking a long time. This is the Jewish Knesset building, the Jewish Parliament building. We were headed there to get a closer look at it, but we could not because, as you can see in the foreground, there are barricades up. They were planning to have a demonstration that day, and as you can see, the soldiers are already preparing for it. So we could not get any closer. I took this picture as we drove by. Ironically, even though in the northern part of the West Bank, Israeli army was fighting with Palestinians over the death of a couple of people and the response to that, the back and forth up in the town of Nablus. This was a demonstration that was going to be put on by Israeli citizens against their government. They are in the midst of making constitutional changes, which are very uncomfortable, and I won't go into it now, but you can study it for yourself. And so demonstrations were getting ready to get started. Later in the evening, as we made, this is our last day, by the way, as we made our way to the airport in Tel Aviv from leaving Jerusalem, we drove by a plaza with a pool and a fountain, which was brimming with suds because somebody, as part of their demonstration, had thrown some soap detergent into the fountain to make suds as part of their protests. We did make our way to Yad Vashem, which is the Holocaust Memorial in Jerusalem. It was very moving. You really needed all day, if not a couple of days, to be there. We were only there for a little, maybe 2 hours. It was not enough. It was one of the more moving places for a lot of reasons. One of the reasons is this sculpture was made, and it stands within a grove of trees. These trees are planted in honor of the righteous Christians who, during the Holocaust in Europe, saved or tried to save Jews from the Holocaust. Everyone from Raoul Wallenberg to Oskar Schindler from Schindler's List, and a number of other. There are 2,500 trees planted in honor of righteous Christians who risked their own lives to protect Jews from the Holocaust. There's also there a special section just for the children. It's the Children's Holocaust Mural, part of the museum, and it is one of the most moving places I have ever been as it walks you through. This is a sculpture of a man named Dr. Janusz Korczak. He was a Polish scholar, doctor, psychologist, and he ran an orphanage for children. The orphanage, when the Nazis came in, they moved him and his staff and all the children into the ghetto in Warsaw, and then they came to get him. The Germans, as well as a number of different resistance groups, tried to get him out and tried to hide him. Actually, offered him an out. Even the Germans did, because he was so highly respected as an author and doctor and psychologist, but he refused to leave his children. He saying, quote, our job as adults is to protect our children, to care for them when they're sick. How could I abandon them when they are about to face the greatest ordeals of their lives? And if you notice something very subtle, the children are all looking in one direction and he is looking in the other. The story is told that as they made their way to the camp where they eventually were all gassed, he told them stories, many of the stories that he had written and other stories to occupy their minds so that they would not look to what was ahead of them, even though he knew what was coming. It's an incredibly moving story, as well as many of the other stories that we heard there. As part of that, when you come out of the Children's Memorial, you come to this hillside. It's sort of on the back side of the memorial. And as you look out over the hills in the far in front of you are the hills of Ramah. In Jeremiah 31:15, it says, "A voice is heard in Ramah, lamentation and bitter weeping. Rachel is weeping for her children. She refuses to be comforted for her children because they are no more." Roughly 1.5 million children Jewish children died in the Holocaust. And this was just that reminder of what Jeremiah wrote in his prophecy about perhaps it was this future that they were speaking of. But again, speaking to the conflict, speaking to the tension that Israel constantly lives under. Again, a moving moment. This is the Mount of Olives on the last day. We went to the very top of the Mount of Olives to this, which is the Church of the Ascension. This is the spot, presumably, where Jesus ascended into heaven after saying goodbye to his disciples. We find this in Luke 24, and we read the passage while standing in the chapel. Again, you have a very low door there in the foreground. This is the rock, part of the bedrock that was there originally. It's the only part of the bedrock that's still exposed, and it's exposed so that, of course, you can kneel down and rub your hand on the rock, which we did while being there. From there, we made our way down the Mount of Olives, which again is a very steep hill, following presumably the path that Jesus took on Palm Sunday when he entered Jerusalem. Along the way, there was established this church called the Pater Noster, or the Our Father. You see on the right-hand side, you see all those plaques there. This is an up close of being from Oklahoma. I had to take a picture of the Cherokee and of the Sioux. There are 97 of these, mostly of this size, some of smaller size, which have the Lord's Prayer or the Our Father in 97 different languages. It was, again, moving, an amazing place. Again, it said to me, the reminder that the love of Christ should be extended to all people, regardless of their background and who they are and where they come from. And so I would love to have spent more time there. Every place we visited, I would have loved to spend more time to just really breathe it in and spend my own time in thought. And would love to go back and be able to do a lot more note taking and a lot more writing and a lot more praying. Moving on down the hill, this is the chapel, Dominus Flevit, which is the place where Jesus pauses on the way to weep for Jerusalem. We find this referenced in Matthew 23, 37 to 39, where he talks about, "O Jerusalem, what you've done to the prophets," and he weeps for the city. This is from inside the chapel. As you can see, it looks out on the city of Jerusalem. In the corner, you can just barely see the dome of the rock. It looks out on across the hill from just above the level of the Temple on the Mount. On the way down, we passed by the ossuaries. These are the ossuaries I spoke of. After the body deteriorates in a tomb, the bones are removed and put into a small box like this. Again, I would ask you to take note of the rosette pattern on the boxes. These are then we know that these are Christian ossuaries, where Christians' bones are buried. And just like I said, note that symbol that's there, the Chi Rho, or the rosette. And then finally, we get to bottom of the hill to the Garden of Gethsemane. If you remember at the very beginning of this, I showed you the 2,000-year-old olive tree that still bears fruit. This is it. Imagine again what it witnessed over the last 2,000 plus years. Imagine what it witnessed that night that Jesus came with his disciples after his Last Supper, presumably somewhere in this garden. It would have been there, standing by, watching as Jesus prayed, standing by, watching as Jesus is betrayed, standing by, watching as Jesus is arrested and carried off to his final appointment. In the background there, you see the Church of All Nations. This is the Church of the Garden of Gethsemane. As you can see, what's depicted there in the murals in the church. It's called the Church of All Nations because donations came from all over the world. And in the ceiling, I didn't take a picture. I did take a picture of it and share it here. In the ceiling are the seals of all the different countries which contributed to this church, including the United States. As you can see, the depiction of the betrayal on the right-hand side and Jesus' arrest there on the left. This is the from the road in front of the Church of All Nations, there by the Garden of Gethsemane. This is looking down the Kidron Valley. That valley is the valley through which Jesus would have come and gone to Gethsemane, and then away from Gethsemane to his trial and conviction. Again, it's roughly a little under a mile from here at this point in the garden, where the garden is, down around the corner to the right, and then back up into the city to Caiaphas' house. It's where he came in, coming that same route, basically, from the Last Supper. Again, this is the Golden Gate from the Mount Olives side, from the Garden of Gethsemane. The place, imagine what it was like for Jesus. He's come to the garden knowing what's going to happen, and being able to look up one last time to that gate that he entered with such triumph just about a week before. It's just amazing. It comes basically to the end of our time. I do want to share a couple of things with you. Number one, I thank you again for new friends. These are two of the pastors. On the left is a gentleman from Florida. On the right, in the center, is from Texas, and we have plans to get together soon. And then me on the right. In fact, the one in the center was my roommate all week, and we had a great time together. Sometimes too much fun together. Laughing and joking together. It was a wonderful trip, making new friends. This is Kathy Gott. She is from Barnsdall, Oklahoma. And she's the other Oklahoman in the group, and we had a nice time getting to know each other, and hopefully planning to get together soon here now that we're both back to the two Okies together. This is an up close of our guide, Ezra Aini, again, veteran of the 6-Day War. He has been a guide for 50 years. He now is retired theoretically, and he only guides the groups that you send from the Knights Templar. That is his one association, and not sure how you all arranged it, but I thank you for that. His wisdom, his knowledge, his stories, everything are just unfathomable, even to me as a erstwhile historian, what he knows and what he remembers and what he shares with us. And finally, I want to share with you again this last picture of the olive tree in the Garden of Eden. This is one of the images that has stuck with me and will continue to stick with me. It is the image that I have already shared on numerous occasions with people since I've gotten back. I remind you that the olive tree is something that would last forever, so long as we don't kill it as humans. That is why the olive branch is the symbol of peace. Peace could last forever if it wasn't for the fact that we humans so often kill it. It's an irony that it grows so well in a land that has been filled with violence and tension and war almost from the very beginning of time. Imagine what could be accomplished if we could get past ourselves and stop killing the peace. If it wasn't for we humans who seek to kill that peace every day, what could be going on in that land and in everywhere else? Because so often we kill that peace just to serve ourselves. And anyway, that's kind of the last image that it was left for me. One of the last images on the last day of our time there, as I said, is the image that has stuck with me since then. Will continue to stick with me. Will be a big part of, I think, my ministry moving forward as I share this story, as I share the story of the Palestinian Christians, as I share the story of the heartache of the Jewish people, and how that tension has been created and why it exists. I am sympathetic to both sides of the issue, and yet I am saddened that as the people of God, we can't find a way to look to the inspiration of the olive tree and really establish a peace that could last. So in closing, I want to say once again, thank you. Thank you for your patience this evening, and thank you for the opportunity to experience the Holy Land, to learn more about the stories that I grew up with, and now preach about, and to give me more ammunition for my teaching, and particularly for my preaching, and for the work I will do in, with, for, and sometimes in spite of the church as I move forward. Again, thank you very, very much. You have given me a gift that is, I know it cost you a lot of money, but it is a gift that is beyond measure and is, to me, indescribable. So thank you.
Pastor Miller, we would definitely want to thank you for a very detailed and informative tour. I can tell you that personally, in attending some of our degrees and orders of the future, a lot of these photographs and things you've told us will definitely pop into my mind and kind of open my eyes. One of my questions was going to be if there was any one particular location, place, site that you saw that really impacted you. But I think we have figured out that maybe the olive tree might be the answer to that question, but I'll pose it to you anyway.
I've thought a lot about that, knowing that that question was going to be asked of me, and has been ever since I got back. It would be very difficult to say what was the most impactful. But again, yes, I do believe that the message and the image about the olive tree, it's, that it's the symbol of peace, and yet that would go forever unless we kill it. And it just reminds me of the peace that we as human beings seem to be unable to maintain. That combined again with, as I said, story after story of people unable to get along and preferring to make war and violence and create tension between themselves rather than being willing to live together in what is truly a beautiful place, and a place that is truly holy to so many people, and has been since the dawn of time.
Thank you. We'll quickly open up the floor if any of our other Sir Knights have a question for Pastor Miller before we proceed on. So I'll open the floor if anybody has a question.
Looks like Aaron Walker has a question. Aaron, you have the floor.
Yes, sir. Pastor Miller, I was wondering, with all of the sites here with the tourism, what was your experience going through this tour as far as the atmosphere around you with all of these sites of the Holy Land? Was there a lot of commercialism and a lot of selling of these sites to you?
All the shops that we passed on these very narrow streets all had knickknacks and mementos, and yeah, there was a lot of commercialism around it. I would say the majority of the actual holy sites were not overly commercialized. We have to understand that for a huge number of people, and I would venture to guess perhaps even a majority of the people living there, they make their living on tourist industry. And in some ways, I actually expected more. Was pleasantly surprised that the holiest sites were not overly commercialized. People kept their distance from the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Yes, you could purchase candles and things on the inside. You could purchase some icons at various places, but for the most part, the holiest sites were kept. They kept it a little bit far enough away that I did not feel creeped out. One of the places we did visit, and I have to admit I was a little embarrassed. We went to a place called the Garden Tomb. It is my roommate and I joked. This is where we almost got ourselves in trouble. We joked that it was a place that clearly was the only place that Protestants could have for themselves, because everything else is either Orthodox or Catholic or Coptic or some other of the old. But it was the most commercialized place, and it really kind of saddened me. The site of the Holy Sepulchre as the tomb, where the tomb was and where the crucifixion happened, it's been regarded as that place for almost 2,000 years. And it is the place that fits the story the best. It is the place that fits the description in the scripture, where the gates were. The garden tomb lies outside of the modern walls of the city, of the old city, walls that were built by the Turks 1,000 years after Jesus, and more than 1,000 years after Jesus. And I can see where, you know, they desperately want make that location the place of the crucifixion and the tomb. But, you know, for me as a historian, the story just doesn't fit, and they have to stretch a little bit to make you believe it. And that felt overly commercialized, because you had to pay to get in, and you could pay more money to have communion there, and you could pay more money to buy things there. And you know, we couldn't use our own guide. Again, you had to use one of their guides, and their guide was less of a description of the history and the archaeology and why, and it was more of a description of why that place moved her. And it was just a huge stretch, because no one had thought about that place until the mid 1800s. So, you know, 1800 years after the events, they decided that this was now the place and have marketed it as that. Now, I can totally understand why people going there would be moved by that place. It's a beautiful little garden that they've created there. It's next to an outcropping of rocks, which kind of makes sense. But even their description of that does not make sense with the story of Jesus, even, you know, their description of why that's the place, because the Romans would have wanted people to see it. Well, but, you know, they then contend that the Romans would not have had it happen up on the hill, which everything I've ever learned about the Romans for the last 50 years of my life would have said, if they're going to crucify somebody to send a message, they're putting them on top of the hill, not on the bottom of the hill. So, I was a little frustrated by that, and a little saddened, and even embarrassed, I think is the word I would use. But again, you know, I have to admit that for those who go there and are moved by it, and if it moves their heart toward Christ, I can live with it. It just wasn't that way for me. So I hope that answers your question.
Okay, do we have any other questions out there? Any other? One last opportunity. You have a better chance than, because they are just back with it within 2 weeks, so all the memories are fresh. So anybody got a question? Okay, Pastor Miller, once again, I thank you, and right imminent, sir, I turn this back over to you.
Thank you again. And again, you all have my contact information, so please feel free to call me and ask me for anything. So
one last comment. Thank you for sharing the food pictures. Between you and Kathy, we have a very good understanding of what kind of feast you enjoyed.
Yeah, I assumed that you had talked to Kathy because she was taking a lot of pictures of the food. I always got there and I was too busy wanting to eat the food, so I didn't get a lot of pictures of it.
Thank you again. Right imminent, sir, I defer to you.
All right. Thank you, Pastor Miller, very much for giving us this presentation. I'm glad we recorded it, because your presentation can be used to promote this program. Other states should be able to access this and promote, use your video to promote this program in their states, because you went in such detail of what they experienced and how it has affected you and what you were gleaning from it. So which is exactly the whole point of this program, is to change lives, to change communities for the glory of our Lord and Savior. So I do thank you for this presentation. I'm glad we have it recorded. So I'm sure our department commander, if he has anything he'd like to say, I'm open the floor to him, and he may be promoting people to come to our YouTube channel just to watch your presentation over this program. So, Sir Knight Laughlin, do you have anything you'd like to say before we shut down for the evening?
Well, everybody, you know, this program originally started in Michigan in 1976 and was adopted by the Grand Encampment in 1982. And Sir Knights, this investment in Christian ministry can't really be illustrated any better than Pastor Miller's presentation. The enthusiasm that he spoke with just shows the effectiveness of the program. And with that said, that's all I have to bring for this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sir Knights. Next month, please remember, we're going to have our Grand Commandery Easter observance, which will be on Easter evening around 7 o'clock. And then we will also have Sir Knight Laughlin will be bringing us some greetings from the Grand Encampment as well. So with that, gentlemen, thank you for your attention this evening. Thank you for your participation in our chat. And we bring this back to your commanderies. Tell your commanderies to go to the YouTube channel and watch this presentation. We need to be able to send more ministers to the Holy Land. And the more ministers that we have nominated, which makes it harder on the Holy Land Pilgrimage Committee to pick ministers to go. So take this back to your commanderies and encourage your Sir Knights to watch this presentation to see the impact. Thank you all, and everybody, you guys have a good evening, and we will see you next weekend for Working Tactics. If John Green